You've dedicated hours into your art, so now let's squeeze every last drop with lighting and presentation inside of Unreal Engine. Let's start with an empty scene with no experience and come out with a set of high-resolution screenshots that you can present proudly on your portfolio. Avast! I'm Vertis. I'm an artist and director in the games industry, teaching over 1,000 university students over the years, many of them who now work in the games industry. So we're going to start a project from scratch. First, we can go into the Epic's Games Launcher and from here launch an engine version. You can also come to File and New Project. New Project, there's going to be lots of settings. So we want Games blank and we want to activate Beast Mode in Unreal Engine. So we're going to tick ray tracing. It's just going to increase the quality of things. Just double check that your GPU can basically handle ray tracing. We also want quality presets set to maximum. So you might already have a project that you're working with and you haven't activated ray tracing or beast mode. You come up to edit and then project settings, type ray into the search bar under engine and rendering, and we're going to tick support ray tracing. For this demonstration, we're going to start with a new level, and I like to take it from an empty level from scratch, just so there aren't skylights and other things interfering with our lighting scenario. So your engine might look like this. Usually what I like to do is take the content browser, just dock that to the bottom. So first thing we've got to do is get our model into the engine. I'll probably provide a different video for that if you want to catch up. We'll drag and drop the character into the scene. First thing I like to do is just zero out. So come to location and tap 0 on each of the axes. So that's going to be useful every time we bring something in. We're not going to get lost in the scene. So as we're in a dark world and we can't see anything, I want to change the viewport settings. So up in the top left, you can see there's lit. I've got some different settings. I usually change this to unlit or Alt-3. That just means that we can see what we're working on. So now we're going to add our first light. Let's get into good habits. I'll right click the outline and create a new folder. We're going to call this main lights. To add our first light, we're going to come to the top left with this box. Under the lights drop down, we're going to use a spotlight. I'm not going to get into the details of all the lights. I'll probably provide a different video for that down below. The main one we're going to use are spotlights. They're the best for presenting characters and portraits, basically. Hey guys, so if you're enjoying lighting so far, it's something we covered extensively in the members. So we all got together in a workshop to practice lighting effects in Unreal Engine. I also released a video that went a little bit deeper into how to light certain characters. We then went away and implemented that and then came back for a feedback session just to see how everyone got on. So all of those videos you can instantly catch up on when you join. And every month we cover new interesting topics. So you definitely don't want to miss out the opportunities that are on the members list. In terms of navigation for Unreal Engine, usually what I like to do is hold right click and then use WASD for the gamers who like that. And then Q&E is going to go up and down. This is a really good way to navigate levels and also navigate our scene. We're going to use that in interesting ways to move lights about, and I'm going to show you how we can set that up. So whenever you brought in a light, you can just use it manually with the gizmo. This can take usually quite a lot of time, especially if you're trying to light things and line them up. So if we press Alt-4, we're now going to go back into our lit mode. So this is how the engine is basically presenting the lights that we put in there. And you can see the changes that it's happening on there. With this character, we've got something that's emissive. So something that's emitting light from the texture and affecting the scene in particular ways. So you might have that, can add another level of interest to characters. Now, if you remember what we were talking about with the main light, the fill light, and the rim lights, we're going to replicate that. So up in the outliner, we're going to rename this and call this the main light. Very important that you get into the habit of naming things, and the folders are going to be important in a moment. I'm going to show you how we can use those. So at any point you can press this little eye, it's going to turn the lights on and off. That's also going to be very useful. So before we move on, there's a bit of housekeeping we have to do, and that's to do with eye exposure and camera exposure. So in an Unreal Engine, every time we move the scene around, the lighting's going to adjust based on eye adaptation. We basically want to turn that off because it's going to affect the consistency of how we're lighting our scene. It can be really annoying, so this is something you need to get used to. So navigate to the same place you added the spotlights, only this time we're going to go to volumes and post-processing volumes. You'll see that the post-process volume is a cube. That's because we basically position it in different areas around the map, and it changes the feel and the mood of the environment. So whenever our camera goes into that volume, it's going to change a couple of settings and parameters, like the exposure, maybe some color values. We actually want to turn that off so it affects the entire scene globally. So if you click on the volume and then come into the search, type UN, and we're going to find a tick box, which is infinite extent, or also known as unbound. You're going to tick that. It's going to affect the entire world. Next thing we're going to change is the exposure. So if you type in EV, you'll see that there's min EV and max EV. We want to zero these out. And you'll probably see that the viewport has changed. So the max EV and the min EV, very similar to humans. You know, when you step outside and the sunlight hits your eyes, you then have to adapt and things can seem quite bright. It's basically the engine trying to simulate that. So we're turning and making it standardized. Okay, my suggestion is you rename this EV and EV0. So that's going to also be important in a moment. We're going to split the post-processing volumes. It's going to save you a lot of time down the line. So now we're going to add a camera. A rookie mistake that usually people make is they go around in the viewport and then start taking screenshots. What we're going to do is set up an array of cameras which are going to act as our thumbnail shots. We can always come back to them and render it from that. Same place as last time. This time we're going to go over to cinematic and cinematic camera actor. Brings in a camera that we can move around with the gizmo, and in the bottom right you can see the preview of that camera, what it's looking at. So sometimes what students have difficulty with is positioning this and basically setting up their camera looking at this tiny little square in the bottom. Something I prefer to do, and you can do this with everything, is actually possess that camera and move it around with your viewport. So if you right click the camera, you can see something called Pilot Cinematic Camera Actor. But what I want you to get used to is basically pressing Shift, Control and P. Once you've pressed that, you see that we are now the camera. And so when we move around, we can actually position this and start to aim it like it was a real-time game, basically. Now this can sometimes be a bit of a dangerous feature. So always remember that when you're finished, you want to eject from here, just like you do with your USBs on your computer. So top left, going to press this button, it's going to eject it, and we come back to the normal mode, and the camera's going to stay where it was. Now this can get really interesting. This is basically the workflow that I use for lighting, is that whenever we click on a camera light, we can actually possess that and move the camera around with our keyboard and our mouse. So Control Shift and P, I'm now possessing the camera, and you can see it's almost acting like a little bit of a horror effect. Now that's really cool, but it's actually sort of useless right now because we can't see our camera effect. So we don't know what it's going to look like for the final presentation. So basically how I set up the scene, we can close the content browser. I don't need that for the time being. Up in the top, we're going to go to Windows, and under viewports, we can actually add an additional viewport. Now in theory, this is rendering out multiple screens, so it's going to tax your computer a little bit more. But there's a couple of settings that we can change to alleviate that, and I'll show you them. So with that viewport, I basically put it onto the side. Very similar to my mum set video of how we set things up. In the top left under perspective, you can actually change this viewport. So we can change it to the place actor that we did with the camera. And you can see it's now previewing the camera that we had. You also want to make sure that you're in cinematic viewport. It's going to give us some additional features. It's just going to look nice when it comes to high resolution screenshot. There's a couple of additionals in the top right. So usually what I like to add is a grid, a 3x3, just for positioning the camera shot. And also action safe, so we can see what our entire frame is. So almost over with the setup. Now as you can see, as I move the lighting around, we can actually look at the viewport on our camera and see what effect that's having to the final composition. So we're moving around with WASD and QNER and basically looking at that second photo. And it's a really cool and neat way to intuitively light your character. So next what we're going to do is change a couple of camera settings. You can see we've got a slight blur on here. We don't like the crop ratio. And there's some cool features that we can do, especially for portrait shots. So another rookie mistake that I see students make is when they're looking for the camera, they basically look around this dark scene and try and click randomly to find it. We found it there. Easiest thing to do all the time. Get used to coming into the top right of the outliner and just click your camera actor. That'll be selected, and then our outline and detail settings are down here. Remember, we've got to clear the search bar because then all the settings aren't going to be displayed. So press the X, that's going to clear it. Well, there's loads of camera settings in here. I wouldn't be too intimidated. Once you break them down, they're nice and easy. We're going to focus on the ones that get you the high resolution screenshot that you want. So when it comes to film back, I usually change this to DSLR. So that just means that the settings are similar to what you'd have with a normal physical camera. That's how Unreal's tried to do it. They've tried to match it to real life examples. So you've got different cameras in here. So for ones like IMAX that you use for movies, things like Epic, so you can definitely simulate some realism there. Now we want to get rid of this annoying blur that's happening here. Now this is under the focus settings and focus method. Right now it's set to manual. So as you scroll this up and down, it's just going to change the focal length. If you recognize there's blurring in the background or in the front for a camera, that's basically what it's simulating. For us, we're going to turn that off because we want the crispest and highest detail on our character. So we're going to come to manual and then turn that to disabled. And you see that's basically cleared up the resolution screenshot there. Next setting down is the crop settings. So this can be useful to actually see what your screenshot's going to look like. So say for example on Instagram or whatever, we work in the ratio of 4:3. So it basically makes this nice and square. So if you're into that sort of posting on Instagram, you'd focus on making this screenshot look the best it can be. But this is more of like a portfolio or a presentation. So what I'm going to do is come to custom and then basically manually adjust this to get a kind of frame that covers the entire character and crops out all the bits that we're not so interested in on the side. So in the crop settings, do the drop down, and then we can click and drag this slider, and you can see how it's adjusting the pinch and zoom. Going to combine that with clicking on the camera, and then because we're still possessing it, we can zoom in and out with WASD. Basically, you just want to frame the character in position that we want. Remember that you can always change this after, so it's just so we can see the entire camera and the character. I'm also using this grid system to see where my outer bounds are, that it's not too close to the side, and also the grid system so it's nicely weighted inside of that screenshot. If you're having troubles, you can always come to lit mode and then change that to unlit or wireframe. That's very useful. Unlit's going to be less taxing on the engine because we're not actually processing the GPU, shadows and lights and things like that. So once I'm happy with those settings, now crop settings, next we're going to use focal length. So focal length is basically how deep that shot's going to be. So if you imagine a sniper rifle, how zoomed in it is and the kind of effect it has on the image, or your camera phone when it's really up and close to your face, it kind of warps your face and wraps it around. That's basically what's happening with focal length. So the best way to experience that is just click here, drag it up and down and see what it does. So I've overdone it here. I put a value of 10. You can see how warped and close that is. That can be good for really close-up shots. For nice portraits, whenever you're doing that, you want quite high value, maybe in the 100s or 120. You want to play around with this on your own character, but in general, the higher this number gets, the more you're going to have to move backwards, like that sniper rifle effect, and also the more sensitive this movement's going to be. So if it becomes a little bit too sensitive, what we can actually do is come back to the main viewport, select the camera actor and go find it. And now we can just make manual adjustments with that gizmo, and it's a little bit more refined. If you're enjoying the video so far, if you like it, you can always come back to it later in your history, and also subscribe because there's going to be loads of content I'm releasing in terms of Unreal Engine, basically getting the best sort of characters for your portfolio. Now that we've set the scene for success, there's no blur, we've got a nice crop ratio, and it's going to be fitting for what we want. We can now start to position these cameras. So with the main camera, there's a couple of things that we're trying to achieve. So if I come into the main viewport and then Control Shift P, always remember that. I'm going to move this around. And what makes a good main light, there's no hard and fast rules, basically what looks good. But as a general rule of thumb, what we're looking for is about 50% coverage of shadows to light. So say, for example, if we look at this character, we want a trailing shadow that sort of goes down the central line, and that just gives the 3D effect and element to that piece. So if you see, if we're front on, that looks very flat and boring, but with the main light, we're basically putting it at an angle, so there's a little bit of shadow introduction. So you can change the intensity in the bottom right by scrolling this up and down. You don't want anything that's too overblast, so we can't see the textures, and you don't want anything that's too underdone where we can't see it. So use a nice little middle ground. Usually what I do is I move back from the PC and towards it just to see different thumbnail sizes. But instead of using the intensity down here, usually what I do is come to the main window and then just use W and S. And what it's going to do is going to move the light in and out. And you'll see the effect that it's having, that it's slightly brightening it and putting it down. So you don't want to use that too much, but it's a really nice way to incrementally adjust the visual. So if we look here, we've got a nice nose shadow. We can see a lot of the torso. I might put it to the side a bit so more of that shadow comes out. Once you're happy with that, I wouldn't spend too much time on it because it could be a bit of a dark hole sink for that. Make sure you eject every time. Definitely going to accidentally move those cameras. You're going to accidentally move the lights. So you're just going to have to get used to it basically. I'll try and remind you every time we add a new light.
Do you want to elevate your game art skills? Every month, I introduce a new game art concept focused on your projects. As a member, you'll have access to live monthly workshops and feedback sessions. These are interactive events with live voice chat, screen sharing, and Discord integration. See why students love our community, getting immediate support, guidance, and motivation. All from a game industry artist who has climbed the ranks to an art director, helping over 1,000 students get their degrees at university as a lecturer. Plus, get instant access to hours of exclusive content the moment you join. So what are you waiting for? Join a driven and friendly community who share your passion. Click the join below or link in the description for more details, and enjoy the rest of the video.
Next, we can come up to here to add the second light, which is going to be a fill light. You can use the recently placed actors, which are useful. So for example, our spotlight. To be a little bit faster, what I like to do is just duplicate one that we already have. The effect that that's going to have is going to put it in the camera folder that we've already made, or the lighting folder, sorry. So we can do that with Control D, or you can hold Alt and drag it. I rename it instantly, call this fill. Now the purpose of a fill is basically to fill in any of the dark areas so it's not 100% dark. If you've ever played a game and you adjust the gamma settings, you'll see an icon and you basically want to make it so it's not very visible. It's a similar sort of ethos for this. So what we're going to do is we're going to go on the other side of the character to the shadow side. We'll or the dark side of the moon. Then under lighting, we're going to turn this intensity really, really low. So start with something like 1 and see what effect that has, and then zoom in and out of the camera. So if I look far away, I'm looking on the right side here, and you can see that there's very harsh shadows. And then the more I zoom, it's slowly starting to fill them in. So that's why it's called a fill light. Now you really, really want to be subtle with this, because the more lights that we add, the more global illumination is going to happen. It's going to fill in that area anyway. So we can always come back to this and tone it up and tone it down. So don't spend too long on it, because everything's going to change the more lights that we add. So once that's added, we're now going to remember to eject. So we're back into the normal scene. Then we're going to move on to the rim lights. So for the rim lights, I'm going to add a new folder. So as you can see here, I've made a new folder called rim. So our rim lights are going to be, I've called it rim 01. So if we duplicate another one, it's going to call it rim 02. Really useful to get into the habit that in 3D and in games. We've also got the folder with our main lights. So we can turn this on and off at any point. And then we can also turn the fill or the main light off and just see what the individual contribution to the scene is. So really useful layout there. With the rim light, we're going to come into it and press Ctrl+Shift+P to possess it. And with this one, we're going to approach it from the back. So what I'm going to do is come to the main lights folder and hide that, so we can just see what the rim light's contribution is. With a rim light, you want to be really intense with that. So maybe something like 150. And you can see it's almost blowing out the character, but it's also separating it from the background, which is the main effect we're looking for. So with rim lights, I usually like to put 2, one on the left and one on the right. So we're going to start with the right side of the image here. And with this, you just want something that's a very, very thin outline, almost like the light is directly behind, but there's a slight outline on the character, just like that. Again, you can change, remember, you can change Z-axes, and that might give a different effect. So say, for example, the shape of the character might be different. It'll all be depending. What I'd say is just look and see which one works best and what feels the nicest. I'd go for a full coverage. If it's not covering the full character, you can actually come down to something called the cone angle, and that's basically going to tighten the cone, or it's going to release it nice and open. So if you're trying to be a bit more accurate, you can tighten that cone down. For a rim light, I usually go with a quite wide cone angle, something like that. So once you're happy with that, remember to eject. Select the first rim light, and we're going to duplicate that with Ctrl+D. Ctrl+Shift+P, we're now working with the second rim light. Then I'm going to readjust that to the side, just on the left side of the character. And you can see we've almost got this outline Fresnel effect. Okay, so once we're happy with that, eject from the rim light, we can bring the main lights in and see what the overall contribution of the lights we have so far. And something that's useful, every time you add a light, you can basically see what it's doing in terms of the scene. So with the rim light, I can turn this on and off, and you can see it's just bringing out more of the character from the background, which is really useful. So next thing we want to do, in terms of the background and what the character's seated on, she's sort of just floating in mid-space. We want to have a nice, something that's blank and not too confusing, but also collects the shadows from the character and adds that physicality. So you can come into basically any 3D software, whether it's Blender, Maya, Cinema 4D or whatever. And what I usually do is create a shape like this. Add some bevels with Ctrl+B, come to the segments and turn the segments up, so we've got a nice curve which will turn into a gradient later. I'm going to export that and bring it into the engine. In the content browser, you can come to import, find your exported FBX. All the default settings are going to be fine. Click and drag this into the scene, and we're basically going to rotate it so it's on the back side of the camera. Now the advantage with the shape of this and the way I've done it is basically similar to the intensity of the camera. We can actually move this back and forth, and you'll see that it's changing the effects of the gradient, but it's also changing the effects of the bounce lighting, because light's bouncing it in all different directions. For example, the global illumination. So depending on where the object is, it's actually relighting the character. So you see this, if the floor is slightly close to the character, it's actually uplifting. And that's going to be important what the color of the background is as well. So if this was a darker color, it wouldn't be reflecting as much up into the torso. But as this is bright and white, it's going to reflect a lot. So we can actually change that. If you come with the import, it imports it with a material. So double click the material, and under the parameters, this color, change it to something a lot darker. If you move this to the side, you can see what sort of effect that's having to the character. So if it's black, it's having no bounce effect. If it's white, it's having quite a light effect. So usually we want to go with something that's mid-dark, not pure black, because that's going to be quite confusing to the eye, and just press OK. Okay, so now we're going to put some emotion and effect into the lighting. With this, I'm going to just duplicate the main light. You'll see that that turns into an X and a light bulb. I wouldn't worry about it too much just yet. We're not exactly making a game. But if that does happen, you can actually turn this to a movable light. That's going to be a very quick fix for that. With the second light, I'm going to turn it into the MISC folder and call it God Light. Same workflow, we're going to possess it, only this time I'm going to angle the light from the top and it's going to give a very heavenly and godly effect that I think will suit this character. So to make things a little bit easier, I'm going to hide the rim lights and the main lights, and we can just see the contribution of the God Light here. I'm going to adjust it so it looks cool, but also at a slight angle to support the main light. You'll see it gives a very deepening effect to the eye cavity, which is where the emotion comes from. And it also accentuates basically any sort of curves on the character and any shining or metals and things like that. As this is coming from the sky, we could potentially change a bit of the color. Say, for example, if it's in space, we could go with a slightly blue, or if it's the daytime, we can go with something that's a little bit warmer, like an orange. And also turn up the intensity, because this is going to be a very bright outside light. So if you're having trouble with frame rates, maybe the recording right now is having trouble, I'm not too sure, you can actually come into the top left, and under lit mode we can put this into unlit, because we don't need to see the actual lighting on this side. Also, we can come into the top left under this triple row and then untick real time, so it's not putting all the stress onto the GPU. It just means that when we move it, it starts to render, and then when we're off it, it sort of hibernates. Okay, now that we've added that God Light, we slowly want to reintroduce the other lights. So because we've got multiple stacked levels of lighting, it might be that we have to readjust these to tone them down slightly. So this stage is just moving sliders until it looks good. For example, the fill, because we've got the background here, we might not need as much fill contribution, so we can turn that down as well. And at every stage, you're just going to be adjusting things so we can reintroduce the rims and see what sort of effect that has. Could be that you want to adjust these maybe in the upper viewport. Instead of possessing it, we can move the gizmo and see what effect that has on the main screen. So if you look at the hip, it's sort of filling in a little bit of the shadow there, but where we're filling in here, we're maybe losing something at the top. So it's just going to be on depending on where you want the eye to be viewing. You know, if I get this rim light and bring it out to the side a little bit more, you'll see that we're getting more of a metal effect and a metal shine. So you're just going to be chasing features to highlight your normal maps, your reflectance, and any sort of emotion that you're trying to evoke here. So now that we've added all the lights that we want to, might be that you have loads of different lights that are highlighting different parts of the character. Now comes the fun part, which is basically refining this with a post process and then taking the high resolution screenshots. Before that, if you click the link below, I'm handing out loads of free stuff. So for example, ZBrush startup materials that are really useful for sculpting, and also a retopology PDFs. Because before going into the engineering and lighting stuff, we actually have to make it real time. So it's a really important part of the process. So I hand those out and send them via the emails. Also, if you're looking to excel your path into the industry, you can join as a Mutiny member on the YouTube channel, which is a really fun thing. There's a private community that we have. We do live videos where we look into deeper subjects, have things like portfolio reviews for members, and also feedback sessions just so people can excel. A bit more of a private affair. Basically every week and every month I ask the members inside the Discord and on the channels by voting what sort of videos we should work on. For this month it's all about lighting, so we're doing some live workshops. Loads of members have been taking advantage already, so if you're interested, click the join button at the below of this video and I'll catch you on the live sessions. So now what we'll do is refine this character a little bit more. We're actually going to do that inside the engine with another post process. So come to the top left, add another post process. Going to rename this color correct, and the same workflow. Type in UN to find unbound and then click unbound, so it's going to affect the entire globe. So inside of the post process, we have loads of different settings for changing the colors. I'll let you come in here and experiment with them. The one that I usually like to change are things like the global shadow, midtones, and highlights, so we can change the color of those and also the intensity of it. So if you tick these on, you can basically scroll this value up and down, and you can see how it's changing the intensity of the shadows, so we can make them slightly darker, or if we're going for a specific emotion, we can actually change the tint of that with this targeting system. So I wouldn't go too crazy on this, you want to be quite reserved with it, but you'll go through and change this for each individual one. I suggest coming straight to the highlights and skipping the midtones for the time being. You want to see what your full range is. What you're basically aiming for is maximum usage out of the brightest point inside of the pixels, which is like a nice white. And you're just looking for the widest range really, and then introducing any sort of colors that you want that adds to the style. So if you look here, obviously that's completely blown out because we've used an extreme version, but what it's going to do is going to highlight something that's useful. So The reason we separated the post processes, we've got the color correction here and then also the EV. It means that we turn off and on this color correction to see the contribution. So if we had done the exposure values and zeroed them out, on the color correction, it means that when we hide and show this, it removes the exposure value, which can be frustrating. So just a nice little tip there of separating EV from color correction so you can preview it. So take a high resolution screenshot. In the top left of your camera, going to scroll down to high resolution screenshot. It's going to bring up this screenshot multiplier. So 1 is just going to be the standard resolution as you see it here. I'd start with 2 of a multiplier, so it's going to be twice as big. And then for your final presentations, you could even upscale it to 4. And then when you release it to things like social media, ArtStation, or your portfolio, you just down res it slightly. So I'm going to click capture. Okay guys, so while I was doing some high resolution screenshots there, OBS actually crashed because it was taking all the resources. But inside of your directory, you'll have all the screenshots that you've done. So I suggest making iterations of these. So for example, testing out different lighting scenarios and see which one works best. So say for example, this one's just highlighting a bit more of the material. So maybe you can introduce that into your next iteration and then just take those different ones and see which ones are the highest quality. Once you've got those screenshots, definitely come into our Discord in the links below and then post in the showcase or the works in progress if you're already working on that character, so we can give you feedback, just see what you're basically up to. If you're looking to enhance your direction into the games industry, definitely join our members. So that's in the join button below. It's a nice little follow on from doing your lighting because we delve into presentation techniques, and also I simulate as an art director how I look for applications, so you can get a little bit of a deep dive into the secrets of what people are looking for. Basically, we do portfolio reviews and live sessions and workshops, and also more specific videos that are requested from the members in the private Discord. So if you're interested in that, definitely click join. There's a lot of value in getting contact time with someone who's an art director and university lecturer on the subject. So I hope you got what you wanted in terms of presenting your characters, and I will catch you on the next one.